In exactly 47 seconds, a live MSNBC hearing turned from policy debate into a political earthquake. Clarence Thomas leaned into the mic, eyes cold, and called Jasmine Crockett a low-class lawyer in front of millions. The room froze. Cameras zoomed in as she reached for a red dossier that could shatter the Supreme Court's walls. What could be inside that file that made one of America's most powerful justices visibly break? The MSNBC studio was a pressure chamber, seconds from detonation, bright lights glaring like interrogation lamps over tense faces. Camera crews moved with precision, weaving through cables as voices crackled in headsets. In the gallery, veteran journalists leaned forward, eyes sharp, sensing the first drop of blood. The hush wasn't polite, it was predatory, certain that history might be written in minutes. At center stage, Jasmine Crockett was all precision and poise. Her deep navy suit cut a clean, uncompromising line against the white backdrop, the silver pin on her lapel glinting with every subtle turn of her head. She sifted through her notes on judicial ethics reform, not skimming but absorbing, as if every word might be her next blade in the fight. There was a stillness to her that wasn't passive. It was the stillness of a coiled spring. Across the table, Clarence Thomas's body language told a different story. His back was straight, his hands folded neatly, but his eyes never stopped moving. They swept the room like a hawk circling high landing, briefly on faces before moving on. He gave short, almost imperceptible nods to his aides, a signal of readiness, of control, the kind of gestures meant to say, "I've done this longer than you've been in the game." Between them sat Rachel Maddow, a neutral figure on the surface, but her fingers tapping lightly against a pen betrayed the energy humming under her own composure. She was ready to referee, but she also knew the power of letting a fight run its course when the stakes were high enough. A few feet away, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse adjusted his tie and settled back in his seat. His gaze wasn't on the cameras or the audience. It was locked on Jasmine, carrying an unspoken message of support. Make it count. The silent countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The air grew thicker with every number. A producer in the shadows mouthed to a cameraman, "Don't take your eyes off Crockett." At 5, one of the journalists in the front row tightened his grip on his pen. At 3, Thomas's gaze found Jasmine's and held at the unspoken tension, stretching like a wire ready to snap. At 1, the red light above the camera blinked on live. The sound inside the studio seemed to drop away, leaving only the thud of heartbeats and the quiet hum of broadcast equipment. Across the country, in living rooms, sports bars, hospital waiting rooms, millions of Americans leaned toward their screens. They didn't know what would happen, but they could feel it in their bones. What could possibly turn a debate on judicial ethics into a national political earthquake? The red light above the camera flared to life, and Rachel Maddow's voice cut clean through the air. She eased the debate into safe waters, her tone steady, guiding the conversation toward judicial ethics. Jasmine's voice followed, calm, precise, pointing out the pattern of unreported gifts tied to the bench. Her words weren't loud, but they landed with weight. Across the table, Clarence Thomas shifted in his chair. He leaned forward, closing the distance to the mic, his eyes locked on her like a challenge. Then, sharp, unblinking, he spat it out. "Low-class lawyer!" The phrase cracked through the studio speakers like a gunshot. Gasps rippled across the room. A chair in the back squeaked. Someone near the gallery whispered, "Did he just?" The sound was swallowed by the electric silence that followed. Every camera in the room pivoted toward Jasmine. For a split second, she froze. Her eyes didn't move, her lips didn't part. Then slowly, a deliberate smile began to form, measured, almost surgical. It wasn't the smile of someone caught off guard. It was the smile of someone deciding how this story would end. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, seated just off to her right, was already moving. He scribbled fast on a yellow legal pad, the scratch of his pen just audible in the silence. Without looking up, he slid the note across to her. "Don't let him steer this." She glanced down, then back up at Thomas, never breaking that faint, knowing smile. Maddow's eyes darted between them, her grip on her pen tightening. The cameras caught every twitch, every micro-expression. The tension had a pulse now, loud, steady, impossible to ignore. Viewers at home could feel it pushing through the screen. Jasmine leaned back slightly, as if giving Thomas room to elaborate. He didn't. His words still hung in the air, acidic and heavy. Her hands shifted toward the red dossier on the desk, fingertips brushing the cover. She didn't open it yet. The act alone was enough to make Thomas's gaze flick down. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered into a headset, "We've got something here. Keep it rolling." No one in the studio moved. No one breathed too loud. The insult had landed, but so had the silence that followed. Would she swallow the insult or sharpen it into a weapon? The studio was still holding its breath. Jasmine's smile didn't fade. Without a word, she reached forward and slid the red dossier into the center of the desk. Her hand rested on it like it was a live charge. Thomas's eyes followed the movement. He leaned back slightly, the corner of his mouth curling into a smirk. To him, it looked like a bluff, a prop for television, the kind of move he'd seen rookies try before. Jasmine didn't look at him. She turned her head toward Rachel Maddow, her eyes sharp, sending a signal without a single word. Maddow caught it instantly. She paused mid-question, the studio lights catching the faint lift of her brow. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer mouthed, "Hold it." The room seemed to grow smaller. Even the quiet rustle of paper from the gallery stopped. On live TV, silence can be louder than any insult, and in that moment, everyone knew something dangerous was about to break. At that exact moment, control rooms across the country lit up. Cable networks split the feed, framing Jasmine's hand on the dossier beside Thomas's smirk. In living rooms and bars, the reaction was immediate. Veterans leaning closer in their chairs, law professors folding their arms, civil rights leaders narrowing their eyes. Jasmine let the moment stretch. Her thumb tapped once against the edge of the folder, a soft click into the mic. Thomas's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, almost too quick to catch. But the cameras caught it. She took in the room slowly, as if measuring every heartbeat. Her gaze swept over the audience, then back to Maddow. The moderator's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but Jasmine leaned in first. Her voice was calm, even warm, but it carried the kind of edge you feel in your ribs. "If we're talking about class, let's talk about yours." The words landed like a pin dropping in a cathedral. A few people in the gallery inhaled sharply. Maddow's pen stopped tapping. Thomas's fingers twitched on the desk. Somewhere at home, a viewer muttered, "Oh, she's got him." Social media notifications began to spike, hashtags forming in real time. And sitting under the unforgiving lights, the red dossier stayed closed, but its presence was enough to tilt the balance of the room. What exactly was inside that red dossier that could shake the Supreme Court? Jasmine's hand slid away from the red dossier and into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a small black USB stick, holding it between two fingers like it was nothing. Without breaking eye contact with Thomas, she leaned toward the audio tech. Her voice was low, steady. "Play it. Live." The tech hesitated for half a heartbeat, then plugged it in. A click, a faint hiss, and suddenly Thomas's voice filled the studio. Not the polished courtroom tone. This was casual, unfiltered. "Private hospitality," he said, chuckling. "Let's just say, some receipts are better kept off the books." The words were crystal clear, every syllable echoing off the walls. You could hear the faint clink of glasses in the background, the low rumble of another man's laugh, Harlan Crow's unmistakable to those who knew. Gasps erupted. One from the gallery was so loud it cut through the feed. Maddow's eyebrows shot up, her pen frozen midair. Sheldon Whitehouse leaned forward, his mouth forming two silent words. "Got him." Thomas didn't move. His face was stone, but his eyes flickered just once. The cameras caught it. Viewers at home saw it in split screen alongside Jasmine, sitting perfectly still, her expression unreadable. In the audience, phones came out like drawn weapons. Screens lit up as fingers flew across keyboards. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram hashtags began firing into the digital air. Low-class truth Thomas tapes, receipts off the books. One man in the front row leaned to the person next to him, whispering, "That's it. That's the line." The person didn't reply. They were already live streaming. The recording kept playing. More laughter, more careless words. A joke about friends who know how to make problems disappear. The crowd's reaction shifted from shock to a low, simmering murmur. Maddow glanced at Jasmine, then back at Thomas. She didn't ask a question. She didn't need to. The audio was doing all the talking. When the clip ended, there was no applause, no outbursts, just the heavy silence of a room realizing it had crossed into dangerous territory. Would this be dismissed as gossip or land like a legal grenade? Thomas finally moved, leaning into the mic with the stiffness of someone forcing control. His voice was calm, but each word was clipped heavy with indignation. "This is a distortion," he said. "A spliced fabrication taken completely out of context." The denial came fast, almost rehearsed. He didn't stop there. He shifted gears into a slow, deliberate monologue about experience versus inexperience, about how years on the bench teach a man the weight of decisions, something political opportunists could never understand. Every few sentences, his eyes cut toward Jasmine, the insult unspoken but thick in the air. On the upper corner of the broadcast screen, a small window appeared. Lisa Bloom joining remotely, her face framed by stacks of law books. As Thomas spoke, she fact-checked in real time, her voice crisp. "That's inaccurate. That ruling predates his example. That's not what the financial disclosure law states." Viewers at home saw the split screen, Thomas talking, Bloom calmly dismantling his claims one by one. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't shift in her seat. Her gaze locked on Thomas with the steadiness of a surgeon holding a scalpel. The contrast was sharp, his voice rising, hands moving, posture stiff. Her silence like a mirror he couldn't look away from. In the audience, eyes bounced between them, some leaning forward as if waiting for her to cut in. She didn't. The longer she stayed quiet, the more it seemed to pull the energy away from him. Even Maddow glanced at her once, sensing that something was coming. Thomas pressed harder, circling back to his theme of respect for the institution. He spoke of tradition of decorum in public service, and how younger politicians trade outrage for airtime. His tone was controlled, but the edge beneath it was jagged now. Jasmine's hand rested lightly on the desk. No notes, no defensive gestures, just stillness. The kind that makes people lean in without realizing it. By the time Thomas paused for breath, the silence on her end had become its own kind of statement. Cameras caught the tension in the space between them, a space that felt smaller with every second. Was she about to swing again, or let him tire himself out? The red light on the camera blinked off, and the control room voice cut in. "We're in break." Instantly, the studio shifted. Aides moved fast, bending low to whisper into Thomas's ear, their hands shielding their mouths. On the other side, Maddow leaned back as a producer slipped behind her chair, murmuring that if this kept heating up, they might have to pivot to another segment. Jasmine didn't move at first. Then she reached for the red dossier, flipping it open with a quiet precision that drew every nearby eye. She turned a page, then another, before sliding it closer to Sheldon Whitehouse. He leaned in, and whatever he saw made his eyebrows lift just slightly enough for the camera crew to notice. Thomas was watching. His head didn't turn, but his eyes did, narrowing as he caught a glimpse of the page's bold header. For a second, his mouth twitched, the kind of involuntary reaction you try to hide but can't. He shifted in his chair, straightening his tie, even though it didn't need straightening. Maddow glanced between them, her pen frozen above her notepad. In the gallery, a reporter mouthed something to the person next to them, both of their eyes locked on the silent exchange. No one could hear what was in that folder, but the body language was loud. Jasmine tapped one manicured finger against the paper, a slow rhythm that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Sheldon gave a single nod, then placed the folder back in front of her. The red cover was half closed now, leaving just enough of the document visible for Thomas to know exactly what it was. The studio air felt heavier. Off mic, someone from the crew muttered, "Oh, he knows." Thomas's gaze didn't leave the folder, and for the first time all night, there was no smirk. Jasmine leaned back, hands folded loosely, as if she'd just placed her opening card in a high-stakes game. And by the look on his face, Thomas had seen the card in the rest of the deck behind it. What did Thomas just see that drained the color from his face? The red light blinked back on, and the studio was live again. Jasmine didn't waste a second. She flipped to a page in the dossier, her voice clear and steady as she began to read. It was an internal EEOC memo from the late 1980s, stamped "Confidential," written during Clarence Thomas's tenure. Her words cut through the air instructions to quietly shelve certain sexual harassment investigations cases involving vulnerable employees, women whose complaints would never see the light of day. The language was cold, procedural, almost casual in its dismissal. Each sentence landed like a stone, dropping into still water. In the front row, a woman clasped her hands tightly, eyes fixed on the desk. 2 seats over, another woman nodded slowly, lips pressed thin, as if finally hearing her own story acknowledged. A man in the back wiped at his cheek, trying to hide it. The camera didn't miss any of it. Thomas shifted in his chair. That document, he began, his voice rising. But Mattow's tone snapped like a whip. Let her finish. Her eyes never left Jasmine, her body angled forward, as if guarding the space. Jasmine kept reading, her cadence deliberate, forcing every word to sink in. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The memo spoke for itself, and the silence around it spoke louder. Every so often, she would glance up not at Thomas, but at the audience, like she was speaking directly to them. Thomas tried again, his voice cutting in, but Mattow raised a hand. The interruption died in the air. The camera zoomed tight on his face, catching the tight jaw, the quick swallow. Jasmine reached the final paragraph, a line instructing that further inquiries be deemed unnecessary to preserve institutional stability. She lowered the page, letting the words hang. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. In living rooms across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens. Some shook their heads, others muttered under their breath. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, shared, captioned. She read it live. Jasmine placed the memo on the desk, the pages perfectly aligned. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes finally met Thomas's. Would he try to bury history or face it head on? Thomas leaned into the mic, his tone sharper now. This is ancient history, he said, each word clipped. Digging through decades-old paperwork doesn't solve the real issues this country faces today. His gaze swept the room, searching for nods of agreement. Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice steady but charged. Integrity doesn't expire, she said, letting the words hang. The audience reacted in ripples, some clapped instantly. Others sat rigid, caught between shock and curiosity. Thomas smirked faintly, as if dismissing her line as rehearsed. But before he could speak again, Cory Booker's voice rang out from the audience mic. This isn't just history, he said. This is about how the highest court in our land treats the most vulnerable in our society, women, minorities, people who trusted the system to protect them. His tone carried the weight of a man who'd seen those consequences firsthand. The cameras cut to faces in the crowd. An older black woman nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. A young law student bit her lip, gripping her notebook like it might anchor her. The tension in the room shifted, some leaning toward Jasmine, others folding their arms in quiet resistance. Thomas's expression hardened. We are here to discuss judicial ethics in the present, he insisted. But the conviction in his voice didn't erase the memo's words still hanging in the air. Jasmine's reply came measured, but her eyes burned. Judicial ethics aren't a matter of convenience. They're the foundation. And when the cracks start decades ago, pretending they're not there, doesn't make the building safe. Her words hit like a slow, heavy drumbeat. Applause broke out again, louder this time, joined by shouts of agreement from one corner of the gallery. But just as quickly, the other half of the room stayed silent, their folded arms and tight mouths signaling the divide. Mattow's gaze darted between the two camps, knowing the broadcast was capturing every flicker of that split. Jasmine didn't look away from Thomas. The room wasn't just watching them now, it was weighing them. Could this fight turn the court of public opinion against a sitting Justice Sheldon Whitehouse? Raised a hand, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Madam Moderator, I think it's time we hear from someone who was there. The monitors behind the desk flickered, and a new face appeared. A woman in her 60s, framed by a modest home office, her hands clasped tight in front of her. The caption read, former EEOC staffer. Her voice trembled at first, but not from uncertainty. I handled those files, she said. I saw them pulled from active investigation. We were told not to pursue them, not because of lack of evidence, but because it would cause problems at the top. The words seemed to drain the air out of the room. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the silence work the weight of the testimony, pressing down on every listener. The woman swallowed hard, then added, it wasn't just one case. It was a pattern. Somewhere in the gallery, a chair creaked, the sound loud against the stillness. The camera cut to Thomas. His jaw was locked, the muscle twitching just beneath the skin. His eyes stayed fixed on the desk, but his lips moved quietly, sharply. A faint click from the audio board, and suddenly his mutter was live. She's lying. They're all lying. The control room didn't cut it fast enough. The words traveled out to millions of viewers before the sound dropped. Mattow's eyes flicked to the producer's booth, but she didn't break the moment. She knew the damage was already done. The staffer's gaze hardened as if she'd heard him anyway. I have copies, she said simply. and I am willing to submit them to the committee. The declaration landed like a final nail. Sheldon nodded once his lips pressed in a thin line. In living rooms across America, people were already replaying the clip, some leaning in to hear the mutter, others grabbing their phones to post it. The split-screen feed showed Jasmine sitting still, her hands folded, her eyes locked on Thomas, not gloating, not smiling, just watching. The tension was no longer just in the studio. It was spilling into every home, every timeline, every conversation. What did Clarence Thomas just let slip when he thought no one was listening? The break was barely over before the control room fed a fresh clip to the giant monitor. It was Thomas's voice, low and sharp, replayed in perfect clarity. "She'll regret this." The studio speakers pushed it out again. Then again. The loop played like a drumbeat, every repetition hammering deeper into the air. Maddow leaned forward, her tone calm but edged. "Justice Thomas, that was your voice. What exactly did you mean by that?" Her eyes didn't blink, giving him no room to dodge. The camera caught every twitch in his jaw. "It was taken out of context," he said quickly, leaning toward the mic. "I was speaking generally, not to her directly." His voice was measured, but his hands gripped the desk hard enough for his knuckles to pale. The denial felt practiced, but the words from the tape still hung heavy. Jasmine didn't wait for another question. She turned to him, her voice low and deliberate. "That wasn't just a threat to me," she said, pausing long enough for the weight to settle. "That was to every community I represent, every person who's been told to sit down and stay quiet." Her tone was steady, but the conviction in it carried through every mic, every speaker, every screen. A few people in the audience clapped sharp and quick before others joined. The sound wasn't overwhelming, it was defiant. The kind of applause meant to be heard in uncomfortable rooms. Maddow's eyes flicked toward the gallery, then back to Thomas. Thomas didn't respond right away. He shifted in his seat, his gaze locked on Jasmine, as if calculating the next move. The cameras closed in the split screen, showing his stillness beside her unwavering expression. Somewhere off-set, a producer muttered into a headset, "Social media's already calling it a threat." The clip was being ripped, captioned, and reposted faster than the broadcast could keep up. Jasmine stayed facing him, not the cameras. The silence between them felt tighter now, as if the whole studio was leaning in. Would this escalate into a direct call for resignation? It started with one chair scraping against the marble floor. A young progressive lawmaker in the audience rose to her feet, clapping slowly, deliberately. Another stood beside her, then another, until half a dozen lawmakers were on their feet applauding Jasmine in the middle of a live broadcast. The move was bold, risky, the kind of breach in protocol that sends shockwaves through Washington. The cameras swung wide to catch it. The applause wasn't polite. It was defiant, almost a challenge to Thomas in real time. Jasmine didn't rise, didn't wave. She simply nodded once, letting the sound wash over her without breaking eye contact with the man across the table. Maddow glanced sideways, knowing this was the kind of moment that producers live for and political strategists dread. Across the country, the feed reached living rooms where families leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. In community centers, people gathered around mounted TVs, murmuring to each other with a mix of disbelief and pride. In a veterans hall in Ohio, a man in uniform tapped the screen with his knuckle and muttered, "That's guts." The emotional montage was playing out in real time, not just on air, but in every space tuned in. Online, the reaction was instant and volatile. Twitter lit up with the hashtag #LowClassHero championing Jasmine's stand. Within minutes, the counterwave hit "Resign Thomas," driven by voices calling for accountability at the highest level. Facebook feeds split like fault lines, old friends arguing in comment threads, share counts climbing by the second. In the gallery, the lawmakers who stayed seated watched carefully, their expressions unreadable. The ones on their feet clapped harder, as if daring the cameras to hold on them longer. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes scanning the standing figures, before settling back on Jasmine. She still hadn't moved. Her calm was part of the statement. The standing ovation wasn't hers to orchestrate, but she let it stand as its own rebuke. In the control room, someone whispered, "This just changed the game." Could this one moment redefine Jasmine's career forever? Jasmine leaned forward, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "If you believe you've done nothing wrong," she said, steady as steel, "open your financial records tonight." The words landed like a challenge thrown across the table. No raised voice, no theatrics, just a line drawn in front of millions. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the desk. Judicial independence, he replied, slow and deliberate, means I'm not subject to political fishing expeditions. The phrasing was measured, but the defensive edge clung to every syllable. He looked past her toward the cameras as if appealing to some unseen jury. Maddow's eyes flicked to the producer's monitor. A new graphic was flashing red breaking poll results. She didn't wait. We're getting live numbers in from viewers, she said, her voice slicing into the moment. 68% say they side with Representative Crockett. The air in the studio shifted instantly, half the gallery leaning forward, the other half folding their arms tighter. Thomas didn't look at the poll. His gaze stayed locked on Jasmine, his jaw tight, the silence between them humming with tension. She didn't fill it. She let it sit there heavy for everyone at home to feel. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, his restrained irritation, her unshaken calm. In living rooms, bars, and office break rooms across the country, the scene played on split screens. The poll numbers on one side, the silent standoff on the other. Online screenshots were already circulating, hashtags morphing into a single thread. She called him out live. Maddow shifted slightly, ready to move the segment forward, but she hesitated. The tension was too palpable, the image too sharp to cut away from. A single question hung over the broadcast like a storm cloud. With the nation watching, would he double down or fold? Jasmine didn't go back to her notes. Instead, she slid a single sheet from the red dossier and laid it in the center of the desk like a card in a high-stakes poker game. The overhead camera zoomed in, the print was clean, sharp, impossible to mistake. Down the left column, dates of Clarence Thomas's undisclosed luxury trips, yacht excursions, private jet flights, secluded resort stays. Down the right, Supreme Court rulings, handed down within days, sometimes hours of those trips, each one favoring his close associates or benefactors. The alignment between the two was so exact it looked engineered. The reaction was instant. Gasps scattered through the studio, breaking the thick quiet like glass shattering. In the gallery, a lawmaker leaned toward a staffer, whispering rapid-fire instructions. Another scribbled furiously, tore the page from a notepad, and slid it to a colleague 2 seats over. Even the rustle of paper seemed amplified in the room. Jasmine kept her eyes on Thomas. Her tone stayed steady, but every word landed like a strike. You'll see, she said, tapping the paper, once this isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern, one that spans years. The camera cut to Thomas, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking to the sheet as if trying to bore through it. In the front row, a senator's brows shot up before leaning toward a neighbor. The word impeachment slipped into the open air, caught by a boom mic just clear enough for viewers at home to hear. Within seconds, the captioned clip was rocketing across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, Thomas' timeline, rising in the trending feed. But Jasmine didn't smile, didn't break composure. She let the silence breathe, forcing everyone in the room and millions at home to keep staring at the evidence. The document glowed under the studio lights, its neat columns telling a story no spin doctor could rewrite in a commercial break. Thomas shifted in his seat, his hands suddenly busy with the stack of papers in front of him, straightening, aligning, resorting pages that were already perfect. He reached for his water glass but set it down without taking a sip. The cameras caught the faint tremor in his fingers before he pulled them back under the desk. The air in the studio felt compressed, like the walls themselves were leaning in. Every set of eyes, every lens, every microphone stayed fixed on that single page, waiting for someone to make the first move. Would this be enough to force action? Thomas's chair scraped hard against the floor as he stood. I'm calling for a recess, he snapped, not waiting for a reply. The live feed caught every step as he pushed back from the desk and strode offstage, papers in hand. His shoulders stiff, his pace quickening. Cameras followed him until he disappeared through a side door, the sound of it slamming just audible in the background. Jasmine didn't move. She stayed seated, posture straight, hands resting lightly on the desk. Her eyes tracked him only for a moment before turning back to Rachel Maddow. Maddow, ever the professional, picked up the thread. We'll wrap this segment here, she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the weight of what had just happened. The studio hummed with the kind of quiet that follows a lightning strike. The moment the lights dimmed for the transition, the outside world rushed in. Reporters were already lined up in the hallway, pressing forward as aides tried to keep a clear path. Questions flew over each other about the document, about the tape, about whether Thomas had just walked away from a fight he couldn't win. Beyond the press line, the street was alive with noise. Protesters had gathered, their signs held high against the glow of camera flashes. Stand with Jasmine. No justice. Above the law and resign, Thomas filled the air like a chorus. Chants rolled up the block, bouncing off the glass facade of the building. Inside, Jasmine finally rose from her chair. She walked calmly to the wings, ignoring the frenzy that had erupted just outside the studio doors. Her expression hadn't changed, no gloating, no visible relief. Just the same controlled focus she'd carried all night. News outlets were already cutting the footage, looping the moment Thomas left. Social media feeds lit up with split screens, one side showing him walking out, the other showing her still in her seat, unshaken. Analysts were calling and pundits were speculating, and the question was spreading faster than any headline. Was this the beginning of the end for Clarence Thomas? The studio lights dimmed, leaving only a single camera locked on Jasmine. She leaned forward, her hands folded, her eyes steady on the lens. "This isn't about me," she began, her voice firm but not hard. "It's about a system that must answer to the people, all the people." The words landed with the weight of truth, the kind that doesn't fade when the segment ends. Her tone shifted, softening, as she spoke of her childhood in a working-class neighborhood. She told of neighbors who worked 2 jobs but still feared losing their homes. Of women who whispered their stories of harassment but never saw justice because the system decided they weren't worth the trouble. Her voice caught for half a second, but she didn't stop. "I fight for them," she said, "and for everyone who's been told their voice is too small to matter." The camera pushed in closer, framing her face so tight viewers could see the light in her eyes. She spoke about the cost of staying silent, the bills that never change the communities, that never heal the leaders who never have to answer for what they've done. Silence, she said, is the soil where corruption grows. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't look away from the lens. It felt less like a statement and more like a conversation, as if she was speaking directly to the person watching from their couch, their phone, their late-night kitchen table. A long breath, then the close. "Justice isn't a title," she said, her voice quiet, now deliberate. "It's a duty." She let the words sit in the air, unchallenged, before leaning back. The screen began to fade to black, but her voice carried over one last time. "Do you believe in holding power accountable? Tell your story in the comments." Then the screen went dark, leaving only the echo of her words and the feeling that something had shifted. True strength does not lie in titles or power, but in standing firm against injustice and daring to bring the truth into the light, just as Jasmine did, knowing the price she might pay. When principles are under threat, silence only feeds the darkness, while a courageous voice can shake an entire system. And sometimes the most important question we can ask ourselves is this: when that moment comes, will you stand aside or step forward to defend what's right? If this story moved you, don't just scroll past it. Like, share and subscribe to Hill Insights, where courage challenges power and truth finds its voice. Tap the bell, because the next story might not just expose corruption, it might remind us who we are as a nation. Which moment hit you the hardest tonight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's not just watch history happen, let's stand together in it. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching.